My name is Claudia Caridis. I'm Vice President of Public Affairs. Mr. President, dear Mrs. Atwood, Your Excellency, Ambassador Asselin, dear ladies and gentlemen, well, good evening and welcome to the American College of Greece. We are delighted to host you all tonight on this very special occasion. I would like to invite to the podium the President of the American College of Greece, Dr. David Horner. Thank you.
It is both a personal and an institutional privilege to welcome you to the inaugural S. Sue Horner Lecture in Gender Studies and Religion. In so many ways, issues of gender and religion move our world, for good and for ill. It is our hope that through this annual lecture, some of the salient, complex issues at the intersection of these two spheres will be constructively engaged and illuminated. This lecture series is appropriate not only because of its focus on core concerns at the roots of human experience, but also because it is consistent with the historical roots of the American College of Greece. Founded in 1875 in Smyrna by religiously motivated women from the United States as a school for Greek, Armenian, Jewish, and Turkish girls. 2023 marks 100 years since the college's institutional rebirth in Greece following the Smyrna catastrophe. This lecture series is named in honor of my late spouse of 51 years, S. Sue Horner, who passed away in 2020 from a brain tumor. I am grateful to so many who have supported the establishment of this lectureship in Sue's memory. I am also grateful that our son Mark and our oldest granddaughter Haley are here tonight, having made the trip from their home in Chicago for this occasion. Issues of gender and religion were Sue's personal, intellectual, and spiritual passion. To give you a sense of that focus, we will now show you a short video from the summer of 2018, when Sue was asked by our pastor at Old South Church in Boston, Dr. Nancy Taylor, who was suffering that weekend from laryngitis, to stand in and deliver Reverend Taylor's sermon, focused on the contested role of women in the biblical and Christian tradition. Let's watch the video.
Nancy has come down with laryngitis and has no speaking voice. So while Nancy wrote the sermon that will be delivered today, she is not able to do so herself. She has turned to a friend for that, Dr. Sue Horner. Dr. Horner is scholar in residence at the American College of Greece, where her husband David is the president. David and Sue have been members of Old South Church for 10 years, though you probably haven't seen them around often as they spend most of their time in Athens. While Nancy is, as you can imagine, frustrated that she has no voice, she is delighted to introduce the Horners to the Old South family. David, are you out there? Would you raise your hand so we can welcome you? Hello, welcome. Glad to have you. And Sue, thank you for being here. Old South Church and the American College in Greece are no strangers to each other. Founded in 1875 by missionaries from Boston and supported by this church, the American College of Greece is the oldest and largest U.S. accredited college or university in Europe. Nancy has been there twice to visit the Horners and to renew the ties that bind this church to that college. Dr. Sue Horner holds an MTS from Harvard, and she earned her PhD at Northwestern in religion, feminism, and history, which makes her the perfect choice for presenting Nancy's sermon, Irregular.
Women should remain silent in the churches. Ouch! They are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission Ouch! If they want to inquire about something, they should ask their husbands at home. Ouch! It is disgraceful for a woman to speak in the church. Ouch. So wrote the Apostle Paul, as represented in our New Testament in the Epistle to the Corinthians. Or did Paul really write those verses? Now, you should know that the Apostle Paul is a huge figure in early Christianity. His letters to early Christian communities comprise a major portion of our New Testament. Paul is an enormously authoritative voice, and it's Paul who writes, "Women should remain silent in the churches. If they want to inquire about something, they should ask their husbands at home." Ouch. But wait a minute. Did Paul really write those lines? Are we sure?
We will leave, perhaps to another lecture, the resolution of the question of whether St. Paul actually wrote those words in the Bible. Tonight, however, we are so very pleased to have with us as the inaugural presenter in the S. Sue Horner Lectureship in Gender Studies and Religion, Margaret Atwood, one of the literary giants of our time. Author of more than 50 books of fiction, poetry, and critical essays, Margaret Atwood's 1985 classic novel, A Handmaid's Tale, was followed in 2019 by a sequel, The Testaments, which was a global #1 bestseller and won the Booker Prize. In 2020, she published Dearly, her first collection of poetry in a decade, followed in 2022 by Burning Questions, a selection of essays from 2004 to 2021. Her next collection of short stories, Old Babes in the Wood, was just published in March of 2023. Margaret Atwood has won numerous awards, including the Arthur C. Clarke Award for Imagination and Service to Society, the Franz Kafka Prize, the Peace Prize of the German Book Trade, the Penn USA Lifetime Achievement Award, and the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. In 2019, she was made a member of the Order of the Companions of Honor for services to literature. As the overwhelming response and demand for tickets for this event makes clear, Margaret Atwood's work is exceedingly popular in Greece. Leading tonight's conversation with Margaret Atwood on the question, does literature matter in this twittering world, will be American College of Greece professor of history and politics and one of Greece's preeminent contemporary poets, Haris Vlavianos. Among numerous awards and distinctions, Professor Vlavianos has received Greece's National Poetry Prize for his 2018 work, A Self-Portrait of Whiteness, the Academy of Athens Poetry Prize, and the Reader's Poetry Prize. Finally, Margaret Atwood's being in Greece on this occasion is directly attributable to Professor Vlavianos's inspired invitation when they were reading their poetry the same evening last year at the Berlin International Literary Festival. Before we welcome Margaret Atwood and Professor Vlavianos to the stage, let's watch the trailer from the internationally acclaimed The Handmaid's Tale television series.
I was asleep before. That's how we let it happen. When they slaughtered Congress, we didn't wake up. When they blamed terrorists and suspended the Constitution, we didn't wake up then either. Now I'm awake. My name is Offred. I had another name.
Ladies, I have to let you go. It's the law now.
They needed to do it this way. All the bank accounts and the jobs all at the same time. You imagine the airports otherwise?
Run, run, run!
No, please don't take her. No!
You girls will serve the leaders and their barren wives. You will bear children for them.
There's an eye in your house.
I'll send you to the colonies. You'll be cleaning up toxic waste and then you'll die.
Tonight is a celebration of Gilead and of what we have achieved.
We only wanted to make the world better.
Better.
Better never means better for everyone.
I want to keep on living for her.
remember your scripture. Blessed are the meek.
And blessed are those who suffer for the cause of righteousness.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to Greece and to the American College of Greece, Margaret Atwood and Haris Vlavianos.
Thank you, Mr. President. I don't need to do any introduction here, so I'll start straight away our discussion. Thank you very much, Margaret, for being here tonight. And since our discussion is taking place in Athens, let me start with certain obvious themes in your work that relate to Greece and Greek mythology. I would like to start our conversation by asking you about a book you published in 2005 entitled The Penelopiad. Penelopiada in Greek. How did you come to write this book? What was the approach? Some critics have called the novella feminist, but you would probably disagree with this characterization, as you expose in the book double standards between genders. For example, The Killing of the Maids by Telemachus and Odysseus implies that in a patriarchal society, women can also turn against women, because in that murder of the maids, Penelope, of course, is guilty in a way.
Well, she's asleep.
Yeah, she's asleep at the time.
Yes, and she's asleep at the time in the Odyssey, too.
Yeah. You want to say the story from the perspective of Penelope, and that reminds me, I don't know whether you've read this collection by Caroline Duffy, The World's Wife, where women have to speak, and you hear the perspective of the female counterparts of famously known male figures. In your case, that of Odysseus.
Well, this is something people have been doing since the Renaissance. So it's not new to take figures from ancient myths and give them their own poems, give them their own speeches. People did that before the 21st century. But how did I come to write the book? It was a project by a publisher called Canongate, in which they were going to ask writers from around the world to pick a myth, any myth, and retell it as a modern novel in a set number of words. So 50,000 words.
15,000.
Okay. 50. So they talked me into it. I think it was 3 publishers who got drunk at the Frankfurt Book Fair and cooked up this scheme. It was Jamie Byng from Britain, it was Louise Dennis from Canada, and it was Grove Atlantic. So 3 publishers. And they asked me, Jamie Byng got hold of me in Scotland before I'd had my morning coffee. So I should never agree to do anything without knowing what I'm going to do. So at first I was going to do a North American indigenous story from a language group of 1. But then I realized nobody would know this original story, so I would have to tell it before I could write a novel about it, and it got very complicated. So I said to my British agent, who can be quite severe, I said, do you think Jamie Byng would mind a lot if I didn't do this? Frosty silence over the long-distance phone. And she said, well, you must do as you please, but I expect Jamie Byng will be gutted. Gutted is a pretty strong word for Canadians. We never use this word. So I thought of Jamie lying on the floor like a fish. I can't do that to Jamie. I said, okay, give me a minute. So then I thought, actually I didn't think, I just reached behind, and out came the story of Penelope, which had always bothered me since I first read it at the age of 16. And what had bothered me about it? If you read the Odyssey closely, the maids who got hanged were essentially raped.
Yeah.
So it was an honor killing more than anything else. And it wasn't that people were having sex with them, it was that they hadn't got permission from Odysseus, who wasn't there.
Yeah.
Right? So I thought, well, let's tell it. And the other thing about the Odyssey that really bothered me was that Penelope does almost nothing in it but cry a lot. Like, she really cries a lot. She gives offerings to the gods, she cries, she gives offerings, she cries. But somebody must have been running the kingdom.
Yeah.
Because the old dad was over on the other side of the island growing pears. So it wasn't him. It has to have been her. But nothing about that appears. We don't see her running the kingdom. The only other thing we see about her is that her teenage son acts up. You know, her teenage son takes the family car,
drives away,
goes off on a teenage expedition while saying disparaging things about his mother. What else is new? So there had to be more to it.
Okay.
So I thought, well, let's hear what she really thinks. And the other thing is that there are three of these women, and they're all cousins. So it was Clytemnestra, bad, killed husband, bad. Helen, bad. Seductive, bad. But sort of good because she doesn't get killed, right? She gets away with it. And Penelope, good, because she's such a good wife. We never see her cooking. We know nothing about that, but we know that she was very faithful. And the other thing that struck me about the story is Odysseus and Penelope are both very accomplished liars. They both lie a lot.
Yeah.
So when they get together at the end and tell each other what's been happening, how much were they lying, really?
Yeah.
How much? So I put the maids in, I gave them, they're the chorus. And I gave them many songs, yeah.
The president mentioned your latest collection, Deree, but you also have written several poems that derive from ancient Greek mythology, most notably Siren's song, Siren brooding her eggs, Circe, mud poems, Helen of Troy does counter dancing. So you were probably interested in ancient Greek mythology from a young age.
I was.
Did your parents play any part in that?
Well, they had, I think the first thing I heard of it was this extremely weird 19th century book by Charles Kingsley called Tales of the Gods and Heroes. And he opens it with a very peculiar introduction in which he says that these stories are morally healthy for children. I'm sorry, they're not. They're all about people behaving extremely badly. I don't know where he got that idea. But then we had an illustrated version. And then, of course, I studied Latin. And in order to study the Aeneid, you have to know the backstory.
Exactly.
Okay, so then what did I get hold of? Robert Graves's Greek myths, which he interprets in some quite odd ways, but he at least gives you the stories and their variations. So you get the whole thing. This person said this, but then there's another story that tells it differently, and these other people have this other way of telling it. And that is typical of an oral storytelling age. Yeah. You're going to get local variations on these stories. So yes, I studied it because I was interested in it, but also because it was there.
Okay. You told me yesterday about Tiresias you played.
Yes, I had a dramatic role recently, which I think you can probably see online. It's something called Theater of War, and they put on ancient Greek tragedies for specific groups, community groups. People from the groups play the chorus, actors and me play the other parts. And I do Tiresias. It's the best part in Antigone because you get to tick everybody off. Yeah, so I
was going
did
to ask
that.
you, because there are two noteworthy consultations with the dead in classical literature. Odysseus consults Tiresias, as you said in the Odyssey, and then you have Aeneas consulting his dead father in the Aeneid.
Yes.
And of course, Dante then gets a tour of hell with Virgil.
Yes.
You rely on this extensively in the last chapter of your book on writing. The chapter is entitled Negotiating with the Dead. Do you think that all writing is motivated deep down by a fear or a fascination with mortality, by a desire to make the risky trip to the underworld and to bring something or someone back from the dead? And you end your essay with Ovid speaking through the Sibyl of Cumae.
Yes.
And incidentally, because I've translated The Wasteland recently, Eliot also uses the same motto, Sibyl also. Why Sibyl? And whether, there's this motivation, as I said, to go down and a desire to make the risk trip to the...
Yes, it is risky. And the Sibyl in the Aeneid says, it's easy to go down. It's a lot harder to get out again.
Yeah.
Easy to descend to the underworld. It's just a lot more difficult to come back out. Yes, this is a motif both in ancient literature and in folktale. There are a number of descents to the underworld and what is down there that people are so interested in. Why do they want to do it? So it's a motif. And when I was beginning this book on writing, I started by examining people's motives, like why did I write this book? And the motives are extremely numerous and contradictory. And you can have more than one at the same time. So I collected all of those, and it can be everything from to justify the ways of God to man, to make a lot of money, to get back at the kids who were mean to me in school, so revenge, money, inspiration,
honor,
everything.
Yeah, whatever.
I think one of my favorites was from a Czech writer who said, I want to create a little boutique so that the reader can go into it and have fun. So that's a little, that's another motive, have fun. And unless you put some having fun in your book, nobody's going to read it. So I collected all the motives, but there was nothing unifying. So after that, I went to writers themselves, and the question was, what does it feel like to go into a book when you're writing it? What does it feel like, particularly novels, but I think it would apply to every. And they all contained some feeling of darkness and then some illumination. So, for instance, it's like walking through a dark room in which the furniture is already there and then the light goes on. Or it's like walking into a dark cave and then seeing some light. It's like going through a tunnel. So you forgot another descent to the underworld. That would be Gilgamesh.
Exactly. Yeah.
Gilgamesh. So he goes through a dark cave as well. He does bring something back, but he drops it. It's the secret of eternal life. He loses it on the way back. Bad luck. That's why we don't have it. So it was the darkness and then the illumination, and of course immediately you think it's a descent to the underworld, and what you bring back is a story. So what the classical ones bring back are stories about the future. The dead know about the future because they exist outside of time. You find this in the Bible too. It's when Saul conjures up gets the witch of Endor to conjure up the spirit of Samuel, who says, "You're going to lose the battle. Sorry." Sorry about that.
In the collection I mentioned before by Caroline Duffy, there is a very funny poem where Orpheus goes down to get Eurydice.
Yeah, another one. Yes.
And she doesn't want to go up. She wants to stay down because she's having a good time. She doesn't want to follow the man up.
Yes. What's she doing down there?
Yeah.
That's so fun. because usually they don't have a very good time in the classical underworld. You had better luck with the Egyptians.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you'd been a good person, you had a choice of quite a number of different afterlives, which were fun, but not with the Greeks. Not even if you'd been a good person, you still didn't have fun.
I want to, since we saw just a little video about The Handmaid's Tale, the distinction between democracy and tyranny comes from ancient Greek philosophy, and more specifically from the Republic of Plato, books 8 and 9, and the Politics of Aristotle. So the question is, how did that enter into your thinking when you were constructing the political system of Gilead in The Handmaid's Tale? And do you agree with Plato that the next step in political evolution after democracy is tyranny? And is America, especially after the January 6, 2021 events, and what actually happened 2 days ago with Trump, showing all the hallmarks of a late-stage democracy that is in danger of sliding towards tyranny? I mean, for other countries like such as Russia, China, North Korea, Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, the answer is obvious. But the more it's about, because Handmaids, it's about America.
Yes. It's not out of the question, but I'm not counting America out yet, especially in view of some recent elections they've had there in which the anti-MAGA forces have won by quite wide margins.
Yeah.
So I think they have more resilience than they have been given credit for in some circles. And tyrannies are fragile as well. So every form of human government has flaws and weak spots. We know that. With a tyranny, it's that the tyrant, the one-man rule, gets encircled by courtiers who tell that person only what he wants to hear. So they lose touch with reality. Some of them have been pretty smart about it. I think Genghis Khan was very smart in the way he ran his huge empire. He was very ruthless. He killed 40 million people, but he was an efficient ruler, insofar as you are an efficient, if that means efficiency.
Yeah, well, Stalin also, he wasn't assassinated. He died.
He was probably about to be, because he was getting pretty loony.
Yeah.
So I think somebody would have done him in if he hadn't died. And I don't know whether you saw that film called The Death of Stalin.
Yeah.
Yes, it's played as a farce, but it's pretty accurate about what really happened. They just speeded it up. And when you have a weak ruler or a ruler who has been strong, who has eliminated any potential successor, which is what he did. He let people rise to a certain height, and then he killed them because they were getting too powerful. Then you have a circle of people who are semi-powerful, who then vie for command with one another. So
but you're not worried that perhaps we may have a Trump comeback, and half of the people in America, those who vote, I mean, he got half the votes in America.
No, he didn't.
Well, less than half.
He never got half the vote.
Well, 2 million less than Hillary.
That's quite a lot. But he got a lot less than Biden.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he seems to be slipping. So a Republican commentator just said, Trump lost us Wisconsin, about the election of the Supreme Court judge.
Yeah.
But nothing is off the table, and no one can predict every variable. And there are outside things that can influence this, for instance, financial collapses.
A related question to what we're discussing. I don't know whether recently there were these mass demonstrations in Israel against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his plan to introduce legislation that will weaken the Supreme Court.
Control the Supreme Court.
Yeah, control and limit the independence of the judiciary.
Yes.
And in these demonstrations, we saw a call of women in crimson robes and white caps walking head bound and hands clasped, and they were dressed as characters from the novel. And this costume has also been used in protests elsewhere. American women opposing the newly conservative Supreme Court overturning the right to abortion, Iranian women demonstrating in Britain in support of protests in Iran, Polish, Irish, Argentinian women also calling to preserve abortion rights. How do you feel that this outfit has emerged as one of the most powerful current feminist symbols of protest in a subversive inversion of its association with the oppression of women? Is the novel more relevant today than when it was originally published 38 years ago?
Without a doubt, it's more relevant today, but I didn't do it. I did not fix the Trump election. Although my U.S. film agent said when we launched The Handmaid's Tale in 2017, he said, "I hate to say this, but you're the only person who has benefited from the election of Donald Trump."
So it is more relevant now, yeah?
Well, conditions changed. It got less relevant in the 90s, right after the wall came down. Apparently, history was at an end and we were all just going to go shopping a lot in the 90s. But then things changed in the early part of the 20th century, and, well, 9/11 changed the chess pieces on the chessboard. And then, of course, the election of Trump. So if that had not happened, people would have said, good show, but it's a fantasy. As Britain said about the book. They've had their religious civil war. They had it in the 17th century.
Exactly.
But America has not had theirs. So maybe they want to have it now. I wouldn't recommend it. It wasn't fun. So the reason people do this is that we live in a visual age. Television and videos on social media, very visual. If we were still living in a radio age, this wouldn't work. And the reason it works, the reason that people can go into legislatures dressed this way, they can't be kicked out because they're not making a disturbance.
Yeah.
They don't say anything. That's the point. It's scandalous for women to speak in church.
Yeah, exactly.
Or in the legislature, apparently. And they're not dressed immodestly. They're extremely covered up. So they can be there, and the television camera goes immediately to them because they're very brightly colored. So that's why people do it. It's an instant visual symbol.
But they do it now across the globe. They do it everywhere.
Yes, because they've seen the television series. It's international.
Yeah.
And it was first some women in Texas, believe it or not, who did this in the legislature, and it picked up from there.
European history of the past century is full of examples of philosophers and writers who, whether they lived in democratic, communist, or fascist societies, supported and defended totalitarian principles and horrific regimes. But how can intellectuals who should be alert to the evils of tyranny betray the ideals of freedom and independent inquiry? How can they take positions that implicitly or not endorse oppression and human suffering on a vast scale? And I'm saying that because I had to struggle with this question myself because one of my favorite poets who I've translated in Greek is Ezra Pound. Mm. And of course, I also had to struggle with another great philosopher, which is Martin Heidegger. And you see that some people actually support evil.
Okay, so those are people of the past. Are you saying that they're doing it now too, I suppose? But what is an intellectual? It's a pretty big category. So just because you've studied at a university doesn't necessarily mean that you're the brightest bulb in the chandelier, or that you can follow a logical argument, or that you can foresee the consequences of your position. And it's also true that at times of chaos, people get carried away. So if things are too chaotic, some people might think, well, it would be better if there was just a person in charge. Then the trains would run on time. They do think that, and if things get bad enough, there's a great temptation to think that way. We just want somebody to fix this. And if that means killing those people, well, it's a price we're willing to pay as long as we don't get killed ourselves. So that kind of thinking does go on.
Yeah, but you're mentioning a time of an emergency, but let's say a philosopher like Jean-Paul Sartre supported first Stalin and then Mao for many, many years, although he saw what happened in Hungary, in Czechoslovakia, he saw that.
Yeah, but then he threw over Stalin finally.
Yeah, but he jumped on the other wagon. He went with Mao.
A lot of people did, because they weren't allowed in. They didn't actually know what was going on. They bought the propaganda. So
but there were people like in France, for example, there were people like Albert Camus and Raymond Aron who actually saw the truth. And in that sense, I mean, all of them were intellectuals. Some of them actually saw the evil, and some somehow closed their eyes.
I do not kneel and pray to the word intellectual. Sorry.
Okay. Philosophers or writers, let's say.
Yeah, they worked with words. You can do all kinds of things with words, some of them bad.
Yeah.
So it's not a question of the métier that you work in, it's a question of what you do with it. So I could say I'm a painter. I just happen to be a bad painter.
Yeah, okay.
So you can be a, quote, intellectual, and you just happen to be a bad one.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, you would know this immediately if we were talking about plumbers. Yeah. A plumber does a bad plumbing job, because things leak. Your toilet doesn't work, like that.
Do you think that one of the problems, since we're talking about, basically we talked about democracy before, that one of the problems today is that most people pay homage to individuals rather than institutions. And instead of thinking of how to organize political institutions so that ruthless or unscrupulous rulers can be prevented from doing damage to the state, they focus on the merits, distorted by the media a lot of time, of the person they wish to elect. And therefore, we see that authoritarianism once again seems ascendant.
It's actually losing ground at the moment. Brazil.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Brazilian choice between Lula and Bolsonaro, I mean, you didn't have too much choice there, but...
Oh, that's a bit of backsliding.
Well, because, I mean,
Okay, given your choice, which would you choose?
Lula.
There you go. Yeah. But
it's the lesser of two evils. I'm not saying that
everything is the lesser of two evils.
In politics.
In politics, we don't have the choice of perfect. We have the choice of which is better than worst.
But you know why I said institutions? Because, I mean, we discussed about Trump before, but the way that the January 6th, basically, all that didn't succeed is because there are check and balances in the system. And somehow institutions did work at that point.
Okay, the reason why January 6th didn't succeed is that no congressman was actually shot. If one had been, they would have declared martial law, and that would have been the end of it. Trust me. I'm not the only person who said that. So it's not so much that the institutions held, it's that the few police who were able to get people out before somebody actually shot them succeeded in doing that. Then the institutions were able to take over. But one of the things that Trump worked hard at doing was packing the Supreme Court, which is an institution and is supposed to be a check and balance. The Americans designed their system the way they did because they had seen the effects of absolute monarchies in Europe, and they didn't want anybody to have that much power. The mistake they made, in my humble opinion, is that they made the head of government the same as the head of state, so that they combined those two things. Instead of having a constitutional monarchy, the royal person is the head of state, the prime minister is the head of government. So the prime minister doesn't have to be good, doesn't have to be a symbol of virtue. They're just in charge of the government. It's the royal person who's supposed to incorporate the total society, represent values, etc., things like that. And therefore, American presidents have a really impossible job. Because to get to be the president, who knows what sort of backroom deals they've had to cut. And then they're somehow supposed to be the incarnation of virtue. And the first lady is supposed to be like the Virgin Mary. And, it's just not possible. It's not possible. No matter how fancy your dress is, it's still difficult to do.
I want to ask you something else which relates to another trilogy, actually, that you wrote. Plagues were a recurring feature in ancient life. We find them in the Bible, also in texts like Oedipus Rex.
Yes.
And usually they were seen as punishments of one kind or another, and they were sent by gods for a reason. Did any of this enter into your thinking when you were creating Oryx and Crake and the world of Mad Adam? But the only thing is that in Oryx and Crake, however, the pandemic is not God-sent, but it's man-made.
Yes.
Crake is the one who deliberately engineers it.
We're totally capable of doing that now.
Yeah.
Just letting you know.
I know. We spent 2 years actually locked down.
Yeah. So his idea is human beings are toasting all life on Earth. So if it's a choice between them and life on Earth, he chooses life on Earth. But first he creates an improvement on human beings by taking all the things about human beings that lead them to devastate the planet and initiate wars, and removing them from his new beings. So a lot of improvements. Number one, they've got built-in sunblock. I would like that. They have built-in insect repellent. I would really like that. I'm from Canada. There's a lot of mosquitoes. So they don't have to deal with that. And they don't have to create clothing, so they don't have to grow flax, raise sheep, grow cotton, any of that. So they don't need to control large tracts of land.
Yeah.
And they can eat leaves, just like rabbits. So they don't have to grow vegetables or crops. Again, they don't need to control large territories. And best of all, they mate seasonally, just like other mammals. Okay, so the rest of the time they're not bothered, and and at mating season they mate with multiple partners, like cats. So there's no, this is that person's child. Children are communally shared, and just to make things really clear. When it's mating season, parts of them turn blue. So no misunderstandings. Also, no Romeo and Juliet. They will never write romantic comedies or anything else. They're not interested. So our surviving human in the book finds them very dull. Peaceful, but very dull. Because a human would find them very dull, would they not? All the things that interest us, they don't do. They do have something which would be useful. They can purr. And when I wrote the book, I was building on some preliminary research that said that purring for cats is a self-healing mechanism. And my brother, who's a biologist, had the following to say about my book, because he reads my books, corrects the typos, and he's an older brother, gives me his opinion. He's a biologist. So he said, "I thought you did pretty well with the sex, but I'm not so sure about the purring." However, research has borne me out. Apparently, if you have a migraine headache, the thing you should do is get a purring cat, put it on your head. We are not told how you make it stay there, but apparently it is equivalent of an ultrasound kind of thing, for what it's worth. I do my research.
You've said in one of your essays that Shakespeare is your favorite author. How about his characters? Because, it could be Prospero, Richard, or Macbeth, but on the other hand, we have, minor characters immortalized, let's say, by Tom Stoppard in that famous play, which was made into a film, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead. And there's a wonderful poem by this Polish poet, Zbigniew Herbert, who immortalized Fortinbras.
Yes.
Where Fortinbras talks to Hamlet.
Yes.
Do you have any character which somehow attracts you more than others in Shakespeare?
Well, I would horrify you if I told you.
Tell me.
I like Richard III. Because he's very forthright. You know, he says, I'm bad, I'm really bad, I hate these people, and now you can watch me being bad. It's very out front.
Yeah.
So
I put Richard, I said Prospero Richard in Macbeth.
Yes.
I did put Richard.
Yes, well, good call.
Good guess.
Prospero is very interesting, and I did write another one of these novels, part of a series in which it's called Hagseed, and Prospero, it's based on The Tempest, which is a very interesting play when you dig into it. It's the closest Shakespeare ever did to writing a play about what he himself actually did, being an author and producer and director.
So if you like Richard, you probably like Caliban.
I like Caliban as part of the play, but Caliban isn't bad. Caliban is innocent. He's a sort of innocent, natural person.
Yeah.
He's not cleverly manipulative the way Richard is.
Yeah. Another question. I was reading some essays by E.M. Forster, in which he said at one point that he was talking about his writing, and he said that some of his major characters sometimes take over and dictate the course of the novels. Has this ever been a problem for you? Or are you in complete command when you start writing the novel? I mean, has a story surprised you in the writing? A character suddenly taking a different form? I'm saying that because in poetry sometimes you begin to write and you have an idea, and then because you are taken by language, then the poem takes a completely different direction, and you like it actually. You actually keep it, the way the poem actually develops. But I suppose when you write a novel, it's slightly different. So
It depends what kind of novel you're writing. If you're writing a murder mystery, Poe was right. They're written backwards because you, the author, have to know who did it.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you couldn't sprinkle these false clues around and mislead the reader, which is what you're supposed to do in that form. But having the character take over, it's a modern variant of inspiration by the muse, is it not? Yeah, that's it. Something took me over. But I think it's just a description of the flow state that happens during any kind of creativity, or even something like skiing. So it means being in the moment. And
I mean, what I mean is, have you planned the whole novel from the beginning?
Not me, no. But some people do. Yes, I don't. I'm more of a...
as you go along?
More like that.
Because I remember when I was a student, I saw this interview, BBC interview with Marquez. And then at some point, the interviewer spoke to his wife. And she saw Marquez coming up to the bedroom, crying.
Yes.
And she said to him, you killed him. You know, the character in 100 Years of Solitude, which means that he hadn't decided what to do with this guy.
Yes.
And then, as he was crying, the wife said, okay, now, you killed him.
Well, you know the story about Dickens writing The Old Curiosity Shop and Little Nell.
Yeah.
One of those favorite Victorian figures, a sick child. So she gets sicker and sicker, and he's writing it in installments, and readers were deluging him with letters, don't kill little Nell. But he just was compelled to do it, and he wrote the scene of her dying with the tears pouring down his face in floods. And then the ship carrying that number of the novel arrives in New York, and there are people weeping on the quay dressed in black. It was a tragedy for him, for his readers, but he had to do it. He just had to kill her off. And it was Oscar Wilde, I think.
Yeah, there's a funny line.
Yes. Yeah. He said, only a person with a heart of stone could read the death of little Nell without laughing.
Without laughing.
It was so mean. Oscar Wilde, very mean.
I was rather surprised to find out that Mary McCarthy didn't like The Handmaid's Tale. Are you bothered by negative reviews of your work, or do you find them instructive, or you ignore them completely?
No, I fall back on revenge.
Okay.
So if you go to something I'm doing which is called Substack, in which you get to publish your own things without editorial interference, probably a bad idea. I've got some, I draw cartoons, and I have a cartoon which has that in it. It's about a book tour. It's part of my book tour comics that I used to send to my publishers to make them feel guilty. So you can find it there, and it's The Blind Assassin. I got a bad review of it too in the New York Times, and it frightened the publisher, so I have my little cartoon character saying, Mary McCarthy wrote a bad review of The Handmaid's Tale, and then she died. Yeah, well, she was of that moment in America. There were two reactions to The Handmaid's Tale in the United States. Britain, they said, jolly good yarn, haha, Margaret, you're so funny. Because they had done their religious war. They weren't going to do it again. They were going to do something else stupid, which they just did. But they weren't going to do that. Canada, because it's always very worried. It's a very worried country. It's anxious. You would be anxious too if you lived there. South of us is the United States. North of us is Russia. Makes you very anxious. So they said, could it happen here? And the answer is not nearly as likely, because we do not have 17th century Puritanism in our infrastructure. And we do always have Quebec as a balance to whatever shenanigans the rest of the country gets up to. So they said, could it happen here? Anxiously. The United States, they said, the Mary McCarthy reaction, don't be silly, we're a liberal democracy, we will always be a liberal democracy. This is very unlikely and just too far-fetched. That was one reaction. The other reaction from the West Coast, where everything begins in America, they said, how much time have we got? And that was in 1985. And somebody took a spray can and wrote all along the seawall of Venice, California, The Handmaid's Tale is already here. Like that.
Yeah.
So split an opinion.
If you had the choice of only one book by which you would be remembered, would you choose one? And do you ever have the anxiety? I was reading a couple of months ago, these beautiful letters that Keats wrote to his brother. And in one of them, he has this, although he died only at the age of 26, already at the age of 25, he said, will I be among the English poets after my death? And then I discovered that Virginia Woolf also had the same anxiety, whether she would be among the English-speaking novelists. Do you ever think about that?
I'm not going to be there.
Okay.
If I am going to be there, there's a whole other story to be told. I do not believe I'm going to be hovering around worrying about my literary reputation. I may be wrong.
Yeah, but actually, I'm going to say that later, but in this latest book of yours, you have a very nice interview with Orwell. So you invite Orwell, and perhaps somebody will, 100 years from now, will invite you and have the same kind of...
It's possible, but very unlikely.
Right.
Well, we did this project called the Future Library.
I was going to ask you about that.
Yes.
That's my next question.
Yeah, that's your next question.
I'll say it. Because I found it very interesting that you became the first author to participate in this conceptual art project called the Future Library, which was conceived by a Scottish artist named Katie Patterson. In the course of 100 years, 100 writers will contribute a manuscript to the project. The manuscript will remain unread, except for their titles. Yours is Scribbler Moon, until 2114. So almost 100 years from now, when they will be printed on paper, made from 1,000 pine trees that have been planted in the Nordmarka a forest not far from where the library will be maintained in Oslo, Norway. So the question, when I read that, I thought, yeah, great project. But will people in 2114 still read books? Because despite all the catastrophes that you predict in your novels, are you hopeful that books and reading will survive? Because there is this very funny essay by George Steiner entitled The End of Bookishness, in which he says, I mean, he's not very hopeful at all. He says that in the future, readers will look like medieval monks who'll be locked in their monasteries and their libraries, preserving books. And they will recognize each other when they go out of the monasteries because they were wearing the hoods, different hoods from Handmaid's Tale. And they'll say, you're a reader as well. And so, 100 years from now, people will read books then?
I don't make predictions. But it was a very well-received project because it was so hopeful. So, number one, there will be people. That's a big hope.
Yeah.
Number two, there will be an Oslo. Maybe it won't be drowned by the rising sea level. Number three, the forest will grow. Maybe climate change won't wipe out the forests of Europe. Number four, people will still be interested in reading, right? And so those are very hopeful things, and people thought, oh, this is really great. So yes, it was well received, but no one can predict the future, really. There are too many variables. So we will see. I won't see, but somebody will see.
So actually, what you wrote, this kind of Scribbler Moon
thing,
yeah, nobody will actually read it until 2114, yeah?
Unless, of course, somebody sneaks in, steals it. Right, yes, you were supposed to do 2 copies. I said, you have to tell people, do it on archival paper. Because if you don't do it on archival paper, they're going to open these boxes and there won't be anything but little shreds. So yes, I did my thing. I put it in a box, and it could be anything made from words. So it could be just one word. It could be a poem. It could be a diary entry. It could be a novel. It could be a story.
And yours is what? Is a story?
I'm not telling you.
Okay.
Yes, you're not supposed to tell.
Okay.
So I put this secret thing in this box, and I went over to Norway, and I thought I would get stopped at customs, and they would say, "What's in that box?" And I would have to say, "I can't tell you." Then I would get arrested, but that didn't happen.
Okay, since we saw the video clip, I want to ask you something about films and books and novels. There is a common notion that the movie adaptation of a great novel is never as good as the novel itself. And I remember reading an essay by Milan Kundera, and that he was very unhappy the way his novel, The Unbearable Lightness of Being, was made into a film. Now, 3 of your novels, if I'm correct, have been made so far into films or series: Elias Grace, The Handmaid's Tale, film and series, and Surfacing. Am I correct?
There's another, but we won't mention it.
Okay. So when you saw, because I've seen both the film with Natasha Richardson.
Yes.
And we saw Elizabeth Moss.
Yes.
In the series playing off Fred.
Yes.
The protagonist. Did you think that any of those 2 women came close to what you had in mind when creating this character?
Yeah, I thought that Elias Grace, they did very well with it. I thought the Handmaid's Tale, they were very faithful. They were more faithful than the original film. And what happened with the original film was Harold Pinter wrote the screenplay.
I saw it, yeah.
And he included voiceover for the central character. But the director, who was in a minimalist phase, took it out. So that left the actress, who was Natasha Richardson, having played against her own voiceover, had the voiceover removed, which made her seem very flat and without emotion. Whereas they included the voiceover in the television, so Elizabeth Moss is able to express rage, but only to herself.
I'm talking about also how they look.
I don't care how they look.
You don't care that?
No.
You know why I'm saying that?
It's movies. People are not going to...
No, I'm just saying that, when I was about 15, I don't know whether you read the novel by Kazantzakis, Zorba the Greek.
Yes.
Okay, and I had fantasized that Zorba looks like, because Kazantzakis was from Crete, that he was like a big Cretan man. And then this was made into a film with Anthony Quinn.
Yes.
Playing Zorba the Greek. And since that time, whenever I think of Zorba, it's Anthony Quinn who comes in front of me. So the way I had to actually imagine the character now has disappeared because it's so powerful. So I assume that when people actually read the novel, and then see the Handmaid's Tale with Elizabeth Moss, whenever they think of Offred, she will come.
This is not my concern, and it's nothing I can control.
Yeah.
Because I can't hypnotize the readers.
No, it's just that
nor do I even know who they may be. They could be anybody. But the thing that is really telling is the film of Pride and Prejudice, in which Mr. Darcy comes out of a lake wearing a shirt. Ooh, oh, that's not in the book. So I always thought that she falls in love with him when she sees his house, but not in the film. She sees his wet shirt.
So there are great novels can be made into great films as well, you think, yeah?
Well, mediocre novels can be made into great films. And great novels can be made into really pretty terrible films.
I know, that's
yes.
Usually that's the notion, but in
yes,
your case,
I don't think there's any, so there's no necessary correlation.
Okay.
I think it depends partly on how verbal the book is originally. So making Finnegan's Wake into a movie
you can't do it.
Would be pretty difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if it's for instance, Under the Volcano, a very multi-layered novel, didn't come off well as a film. It just seems to be about a drunk.
Yeah.
Because you can't get all the layers in. But something like The Maltese Falcon, which is a pretty straightforward detective story, it's a great film.
Yeah.
Night of the Hunter, sort of middle-of-the-road novel, wonderful film. Very beautifully directed by Charles Laughton, who was a painting collector.
I think The Remains of the Day was also made quite.
Remains of the Day.
Yeah. Human Stain, perhaps.
Yeah, so it depends on what kind of book it is.
Yeah.
I think. Some you can do it, others you can't. Sometimes you could do it, but you do it badly. That can happen too. Movies are so dependent on so many different people. So you can have what looks like a great script, you can hire all these wonderful actors, and the movie still won't be good.
You said that they actually followed the book, in the series, they followed your book very closely. And now
Alias Grace, yes.
Yeah. And,
Handmaid's Tale they've had to invent because the first season follows the book closely, and then they had to make stuff up.
I just remember now that when I saw Bryce Revisited, because I read the book, and actually it was really closely done. I mean, all the dialogues are exactly like in the book.
And this is good or bad?
In my case, it was good. I liked it.
It was good.
Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes it's bad. But you can't predict it. It's a different art form.
Yeah.
So translating one into the other, you have to translate it into a good example of the art form you're translating it into. It's like translating languages. You know this because you translate a lot. So you have to make a good poem in Greek.
Yeah.
It's not enough to be literal.
Exactly. I was going to, since we talk about poetry, in your latest collection, I found quite interesting actually the preface. Let me read the last sentence. You say here, poetry deals with the core of human existence, life, death, renewal, change, as well as fairness and unfairness, injustice and sometimes justice, the world in all its variety, the weather, time, sadness, joy, and birds. There are more birds in these poems than there used to be. I wish for even more birds in the next book of poems, should there be one, and I wish also for more birds in the world. Let us hope. Let us all hope, which I find quite nice actually. First of all, it reminded me, because I recently translated Emily Dickinson, and she has so many birds in her poetry, especially the robin. But when I read your preface, I thought more birds in the world is like, it's like making a statement that something is going wrong with the environment at the moment. And
I'm not alone in noticing that.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, so we have 3 billion fewer birds in the world today than we had in the 50s.
3 billion?
3 billion. Yeah, so what are the factors? Glass windows, removal of environments, toxicity, and feral cats. That's it.
That's it.
Yeah. Ask the bird people, they'll tell you the same thing. So we did this graphic novel called Angel Catbird as a bird helping project. It's a superhero book. So superheroes in the 40s were created by falling into a vat of chemicals. Superheroes, a couple of, maybe 15 years later, were created by bites from radioactive spiders. So Angel Catbird is caused by a collision between a car, an owl, a human being, a cat, and a vial of CRISPR gene splicer. Okay?
Okay.
But we know that it's no good to say your cat is a monster and you have to get rid of it, because people who love cats, and I've been one of them, I know this. So we had to make a book that was friendly to both cats and birds. And it's got a lot of stats in it, like if you let your cat out and let it roam freely, its chances of being killed by a car are like 80%.
Yeah.
Things like that.
I was looking at another book of yours called Survival.
Yes.
Which is the Guide for Canadian Literature.
1972.
Yeah.
That's a while ago.
Okay, no, I'm just, okay. But what I find interesting, and I'll tell you why, is that you try to identify and promote a distinctive national Canadian identity. So my question is, what exactly is this identity? What does it mean to be Canadian when Canadian authors belong to that large family of writers that speak and write the same language? I'm excluding here the French-speaking Canadians who mostly live in Quebec. The reason why I'm asking that is because many people in the audience who are Greeks know that we Greeks are actually obsessed with identity and Greekness. And many of our national poets, you know, in their work you can detect that anxiety about the meaning of Greekness. And I have to confess that when I read Canadian poetry, I mean, your work, you know, Anne Carson's, Michael Ndadje, we spoke about Lorna Crozier yesterday. If they didn't tell me that that you are Canadians, I was just reading the poems, I wouldn't be able actually to see that there is big differences between that poetry and the poetry of some of your American neighbors. So is there some kind of any demarcation line between the two literatures?
Okay, let's talk about novels rather than poetry. It's much easier.
Okay.
But let us also point out, why did I write this book? It's because at the time I wrote it, there was nothing written about this. And Canadians were always being told either that they didn't exist, or that, yes, there was Canadian literature, but it was a second-rate version of either American literature or British literature. So the project in the book was to distinguish it from American on the one hand and British on the other hand. And why would it not be different? Because the geopolitical situation of Canada is quite different. It is a small country, not a big one. It has never been an empire. And it is northern. So the United States, some of it's northern, but an awful lot of it is southern. Or to put it in very short form, north of us we have Russia, and south of us we have the United States. North of the United States, they have us, a wussy country, and south of them they have Mexico. So that's really a different situation. It's also very different if you were a great power. Canada is not a great power. I hate to break this to you, but it isn't. It's very big. And there is a popular song called Canada's Really Big, which in true Canadian style makes fun of everything. So I concentrate on the novels of those times and some narrative poems. If you look at narrative poems of those times, you can see that they're quite different. To give you a short illustration, animals. Animals in British literature, an awful lot of them are little Englishmen disguised as animals. So the White Rabbit in Alice in Wonderland, Winnie the Pooh, The Wind in the Willows, they have a class system. They have, we know what Badger is. Badger is the English country sort of guy. Mole is middle class. We could go on. America, an animal is something you hunt and kill for its totemic value. Dare I mention the white whale in Moby Dick, the true subject of which is the ship of state, namely the United States. Crazy captain, nutty pursuit, never mind. And in Canada, the animal poems, the animal writings are from the points of view of animals. They originated the story from the point of view of the animal, in which human beings don't come off so well. Just letting you in on that.
You should probably.
We do have a poem about.
You should probably make Cavafy also Canadian, because he wrote a wonderful poem where the horses of Achilles speak.
Well, but that's later.
That's later.
The Canadians were doing this in the 19th century.
Okay.
Yeah.
But
this book, we invented basketball, so why wouldn't? Bad us. Why did we do that?
In your latest book that the president mentioned, All Babes in the Wood, there's a short story titled Airborne.
Yes.
In which 3 elderly friends get together to sip gin and tonic and work on a plan to endow a university chair in feminist studies. "We are correcting the gender balance," says one of the elderly friends reproachfully, "because a lot of more male creatives still get the big jobs and win the awards and things." To which her friend replies, "We're laying the foundation for the brave new generation of emerging non-cis male creatives. And by the way, I hate creatives too. They're not a separate class of people. Everyone is creative." Can you elaborate on this? I detect an irony here on your part on the whole gender issue, if I'm right.
Well, this is how old people talk, don't they? Especially old feminists. So I'm just, letting you backstage and letting you in on some of the conversation. But every era has got its jargon, shall we say?
Yeah.
And one era's jargon is the next era's out-of-date manner of speaking. So pretty soon a lot of these terms that get quite loosely used now are going to be out of fashion. And creatives is one of them. So it's as if creatives are sort of over here being a little crazy, and then normal people are over here not being creative. And that's just not true. Human beings are creative. They just create in different fields. Are you following me?
I am, but I am. But you say, the phrase is a generation of emerging non-cis male creatives. So yes. I take that to be a point about gender here as well, not just about creatives and non-creatives.
Gender is much discussed these days.
Yeah.
But I would say that discussion is undergoing various forms of evolution, and talk to me again in 5 years and we'll see where we are then.
Okay, I will.
But let us say that those who said male and female, he created them, didn't know anything about slugs.
Yeah.
Not studied slugs, nor mushrooms.
Yeah.
So things are not in 2 sealed boxes in nature. If they were, we wouldn't have evolution. Nature goes in for a lot of pretty edgy things, like fish that walk.
Yeah.
And Greek mythology is full of those things.
Yeah.
There are a lot of hybrid creatures. There are a lot of transformations. I just saw a theatrical performance of Ovid's Metamorphoses. And full of, people get turned into, nobody gets turned into a slug, worse luck, but they get turned into trees, they get turned into birds quite a lot. Male into female, female into male, a lot of transformation.
Daphne was turned into a tree when Apollo was trying to rape her.
Yeah, she's one of the people that got turned into a tree. Somebody else got turned into a fountain.
Yeah.
A lot of transformations. So that is actually truer to nature. The metaphor is truer to nature than some kind of sealed box theory.
I find quite interesting that on your essay on Kafka, you write, and I quote, "One of the most unexpected things I learned about him from the ages of 19, this is when you first wrote that essay on Kafka, and 60, was that he found a lot of his work uproariously funny."
He found it funny.
Yeah, he found it. And my question is, do you yourself find the trial or the castle funny in any way? Or do you find life very funny? Because when I read your essay on Kafka, I remember an essay that Borges has written on Kafka. And Borges says, commenting on Kafka, that Kafka is both complex, the way that he sees the world is both complex and meaningless. So do you agree with that? I mean, do you find the trial and the castle funny, or like Borges says?
Well, I certainly didn't find them funny when I read them at the age of 20. But of course, young people are notoriously serious. They're very earnest when they're not making absolutely ludicrous jokes.
Yeah.
So I think your point of view changes. But no, I don't quite grasp why he would find
them funny.
Well, particularly not in the penal colony. I didn't find that funny either, although it turns on a concept of language that's quite amusing. But no, I don't find them that funny. But then I'm not German.
I like that because my wife was raised in Germany. I always make that point. So,
do you?
So now you're supporting me on that point.
Well, there is my daughter who speaks German says people don't understand that Germans do have a sense of humor. They just don't do punchlines, because in German the verb always comes at the end. So their whole day is filled with punchlines. You have to wait for it until you find out what it means. So the punchline, it's not a surprise to them. So it's not funny. So their humor is situational, and that would be more like Kafka.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So not funny jokes, but funny absurdist. Yeah.
In your fiction, you have imagined societies riddled with misogyny, oppression, environmental havoc. We discussed that.
Unlike real life, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And as I said, and some people, reviewers and critics, have called you the prophet of dystopia. And people actually, sometimes when they talk about some of the novels, they use the word dystopia, and they think of Orwell, 1984, and Brave New World, Huxley. But on the other hand, you keep writing, publishing your works, and I think that's also a sign of hope. And I think that some of the characters, although you speak of the degradation of the human condition, you seem to have a certain affection for your characters and sympathize with their plight, especially since you mentioned before Elias Grace. I found that you're very sympathetic to that character, and you try to somehow see his side. I mean...
Well, it was a real historical double murder, and nobody ever knew whether she did it or not. So if we had known, I wouldn't have written a novel about it, because it wouldn't have been interesting.
Yeah.
The interesting thing to me was that we didn't know. And the interesting thing about writing the book was to write it in such a way so that we still don't know. We do not know.
But there is a sense of optimism sometimes I get in the novel.
I've never killed everybody off, have I? There's always somebody left.
Unlike Shakespeare, in some of his tragedies, nobody's left.
No, Fortinbras is left.
Fortinbras, yeah. But
yes. Everybody else is in a pile on the floor, but Fortinbras is left. Oh, Horatio is left.
Yeah.
Yes. That's the point of Horatio. Somebody has to be left to tell the story. Yes. But there are people who have killed everybody off.
So I'm just thinking that sometimes you read, especially in my case, you read poems that are so pessimistic, but then the actual act of writing is always,
It's always an act of optimism, because think of all the things you're being hopeful about. Number one, you'll finish it, whatever it is, because sometimes you don't. I've started a lot of things I've never finished. So you hope at the beginning that you're going to finish this, and then you hope that it will be published, another big hope. And then you hope that if it's published, somebody will read it.
Yeah.
And then you hope, another big hope, that if they read it, they will like it.
Yeah.
So these are big hopes. And no matter how pessimistic the writer or gloomy they may be, however gloomy their content, all of those hopes have gone into the creation of this work.
I agree. I want to ask you something about ostracism, which we know was an Athenian procedure in which any citizen could be expelled from the city-state of Athens for 10 years. And we see nowadays, more and more, in the context of counterculture, many people being ostracized and cancelled. Do you think that what began as a movement to redress past injustices and give disenfranchised people a voice has gone too far in the direction of an extreme intolerance that threatens the free expression of ideas?
Well, this is a complex question. Let me draw you my little diagram, because it's so useful. It's a circle. Up at the top is tyranny. Down at the bottom is chaos. Through the middle is liberal democracy. There's an arrow going up on both left and right towards tyranny. You can get there either way. There's an arrow going down from both left and right to chaos. You can get there either way too. But once you've got chaos, there comes a moment when people say, we just want the trains to run on time. Or they say, I alone can fix it. And you have a big arrow going up from either direction all the way up to tyranny. So the other rule is, once you invent a weapon to use against those you feel are wrong and evil, the other side is going to adopt that weapon and use it against you very quickly, if it's a weapon that works. So Obama won the election because Democrats had discovered social media and Republicans had not at that time. But then they did. They turned it around. Okay, so banning, canceling all of this stuff was being used on social media by people who identified as being on the left. Okay. What do we have now? We have the right in the United States banning books and censorship. So it's the same impulse. The impulse is, you shall not speak. So once you get rid of one of the foundations of democracy, which is freedom of expression, which originally meant not that you could say anything you wanted, but that if you expressed a political opinion, you wouldn't be put in jail or hanged. Okay, that's what it was originally about. But once you shut down that very idea, you have endorsed the idea of shutting it down, and that will be used against you. And that's what we are seeing now. So who do I support in this? I support PEN America, which has tried to hold the middle ground.
But I assume the middle ground will not be to rewrite books or what's happening now. I was reading about Roald Dahl and they're trying to actually change words and put other words.
Okay, so yes, they got such a pushback against rewriting Roald Dahl that they now have two versions. It's like Coca-Cola. They've got Coca-Cola Original and they got Coca-Cola Light. So they've got Roald Dahl Original and they've got Roald Dahl Light. And you can, if you want to read them at all, you can choose which, freedom of choice, right? You can have whichever one, but I prefer Chaucer's statement about this when he was about to tell a raunchy tale. He said, I'm about to tell you a tale that some people will find offensive, he says in essence. And if you don't like this one, turn the page and read something else. Yeah, it's very good advice. If you don't like what you're reading, and I sometimes don't, book has got this thing called covers. Put them together. You don't have to see what's inside.
Now, we put the title of our discussion, about this twittering world, And there's a lot of discussion nowadays about, artificial intelligence and chat box like ChatGPT that apparently can compose essays and poems and short stories. Do you think that artificial intelligence will undermine the position of the author as the master of language and the creator of literature? That's one question. And the second is, which is, I think, slightly related, is how about children and teenagers, the Zoomers today, the members of Generation Z, who are spending more time on electronic devices and on Instagram, TikTok, and less time reading books than before? Apart from the obvious implications that you have psychoanalysts talking about that relate to their attention span and vocabulary, will this development undermine their capacity for critical thinking and their ability to become active and informed citizens, you think?
Let's find out.
Let's wait.
I don't know. First of all, have you heard of Book Talk? T-O-K.
Yeah.
So this sells a huge number of books. It's teenagers recommending books to other teenagers, not always the ones that the publishers or their teachers would wish them to read, but recalling being a teenager. I read books that my teachers and publishers wouldn't have wanted me to read either, because that's one of the things that teenagers do. So certain kinds of social media are quite helpful in selling books. And they just don't always happen to be the books that people have in mind. So I don't know where this is going, and neither does anybody else. But as for AI-generated texts, all you have to say is they should have a little seal that says AI-generated.
Okay.
And then at least we would know what we were reading. A lot of these modeling computer programs are pretty unpredictable now.
Pretty unpredictable.
They're not predictable. And they turn out to lie quite a lot. They tell quite a lot of lies because they're processing information, not all of which is true. So you can't rely on them to tell you the truth either. We are in a hazy area here, but guess what? We always have been. Was the gossip at the village well always accurate? No, it was not. Were things that you read in newspapers always true? No, they were not. So this is just part of the human propensity to repeat scandalous stories and tell lies.
Okay.
Not my fault. Didn't do it.
So it's just, what you're saying is just we have to be alert on that.
Well, as alert as we can be. The trouble is you are not always in a position to investigate the truth of something, particularly if it's coming from a quotes expert.
Yeah.
You know, you're not a dentist. I don't think you're a dentist. No.
That's my nightmare. Dentists are my nightmares.
It's mine too. Gosh,
Yeah.
what a horrible thing. You're not a microbiologist. You're not an investigator of viruses. So who are we going to believe here? That's the problem.
Yeah.
And it would be very helpful if pharmaceutical companies had never told big whoppers, but they have. So not everything they say is always true. And if there were any human entity that we could rely on to have always told the truth, it would probably be the first time in history, apart from the Delphic Oracle,
Yeah.
which told the truth, but in such a disguised way that nobody could figure out what it was saying. Yeah, the difference between novel writers and people who say that they're experts is it says on the novel, it's labeled, it says fiction. Sort of like cigarettes. These will kill you. Yeah.
Something funny now. I found that your contribution to Canadian literature was celebrated with a special stamp. That's quite funny, actually. How do you feel seeing your face on a stamp? I mean, usually
stamp. Yeah.
You don't. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know. In Greece, stamps are people who,
Dead people.
dead people.
Yeah, well, being almost dead is almost nearly
not
the
almost
same. Yeah.
No, but they did that quite a few years ago.
No, they did it about 2 years ago.
2 years ago.
Yeah, so I was almost nearly dead then too. Well, it was a lot of fun because at the launch party, it was the first time anybody had been out to a party in 2 years.
Because of COVID.
Yeah, so you would think a stamp launch would be really boring, but people were quite giddy. They had a wonderful time. I'm out. Yes, I'm with people. Yeah, so it was a lot of fun, and they put a lot of effort into it. So it's better than being on money.
I actually haven't seen the stamp itself. Is it like Queen Elizabeth profile? Or?
No. It's much more fun than that. You can look it up on the internet.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a fun stamp. It is a little bit creepy to find a letter with, your face blanked out because they put the stamp on it, but never mind. Yes, it was fun.
In the book, as I said before, there is this kind of discussion between you and Orwell, and you're discussing also Huxley. And I remember there was this professor of mine who said that 1984 in the Orwellian world was something that it's more obvious because you can actually feel it. I mean, it's all about concentration camps, gulags, executions, the boot on the face. And the Huxley one, it's different, and it's more kind of dangerous because you don't actually detect it easily. So in the Orwell book, part of censorship is burning books. In Huxley, you don't have to burn books; you just make them irrelevant. So you create a kind of society where basically doesn't read. You give them pornography and gin or whatever. And in your discussion between the two of them, it seems that you take a middle the ground approach, that you can have both. In some cases you have still Orwell, in some cases you have Huxley. And of course Orwell you can have in all the countries we mentioned before. But let's say, going back to America again, because we talked about it, do we see what? I mean, in some Western democracies, are we more close to the Huxley model? And you in your novels, I mean...
Yes, we used to have a contest like that in the 90s. So which was going to win, Orwell or Huxley? So after 1989, when the wall came down, Huxley was winning.
Huxley was winning.
He was, but he's not winning anymore because life is becoming too unpleasant in a lot of places, even a lot of places in the United States. So you know that Huxley was very influenced for Brave New World by visiting Hollywood at that time. So these fancy dresses, all these sort of perfumes and movies. Everybody was going to the movies and they were taking drugs. He was quite keen on drugs, actually, himself. So yeah, that was a vision of America. Very few people actually lived that way, but that's what he was influenced by. So I don't know. It's dystopias and utopias are always joined at the hip.
Yeah.
And there's always a little dystopia inside a utopia, and there's always a little utopia inside of dystopia. They're a yin and yang arrangement. So better than what and worse than what, we always ask ourselves. The original models are heaven and hell. Hell is the real dystopia where you don't want to be.
Yeah.
And heaven is presumably the place where you do want to be. Although, as Dante says, heaven is where you forget everything, and hell is where you remember everything.
Okay.
That's hell, remembering everything. So then we relocated these to other planets, which gave us science fiction, or a lot of it. Yeah, so we're always, that's we as human beings, because we always think it could be better, and we always think it could be worse, unless it really is the absolute worst. But guess what? It's never the absolute better.
Yeah.
Utopia is more difficult to achieve.
You say that you hate dentists as I do, and I just found out...
No, I don't hate dentists.
You don't?
I would hate to be a dentist.
Ah.
That's different.
Okay.
Very different.
So you hate to be a dentist. I hate dentists myself, but...
No, you shouldn't hate them. They will save your life. You need to go. You need to go.
No, I do go. I do go, but the trip to the dentist is quite, it's a nightmare. Anyway, I discovered we have something in common, that you play online solitaire.
Yes, that's a bad habit.
I know, I'm just, because I like to play cards myself. And the question is, do you do it as a kind of a method of relaxation, or as you play, you contemplate your new project? And what I mean is, do you have any ritual that gets you set for writing?
I've played it enough now, so I know its pattern, so I'm pretty bored with it. You have a better chance of getting a random arrangement with actual playing cards.
Yeah, we do play that.
They have their method. I know what it is.
Yeah.
So.
But do you have any ritual when you start writing? I mean, do you do something?
Oh, a ritual when I start writing. I hate to disappoint. I wish I had a ritual. It would make me much more colorful and weird.
No, sometimes people don't have. I just start writing. I mean.
Do you have one?
No.
You go to the dentist. No. We'll go to the dentist as a way of avoiding starting my novel. I think most of my rituals are procrastination rituals.
Really?
Yeah, so just avoid just getting into it. So being Canadian, you don't have this problem here, but anytime you go swimming in the wilds of Canada, it's going to be freezing cold. So going into a book is like that. Like, am I going to go in there? No, well, maybe, no. And the only way of doing it is to run in screaming. So eventually you have to run in screaming into your novel, because you're never going to get in there otherwise.
Are you working on something now?
Not telling.
Not telling?
I'm very secretive.
Okay.
Yes. If you tell, then you might actually have to do it. Or if you don't do it and you've told, people are going to ask you forever, well, you said you were writing so-and-so and you didn't do it. Why didn't you? Well, I just didn't. Yeah.
Okay, the Scribner Moon one, we don't know what it is, but the next thing we will find out.
Maybe.
Soon, yeah.
if I do it.
Who are the writers who have, technically speaking, influenced your development as a writer? I mean, obviously because you do both novels and poetry. I mentioned Cavafy before. Have you ever read Cavafy?
Yes.
Do you like him, and is there any way that he...
I was too old. I think you get influenced by things when you're quite young, because your brain is not hardened into cement. Whereas when you're somewhat older, you've already been influenced, and that's kind of it. So you can read things and enjoy them, but they're not necessarily going to have an effect on you.
And who are the novelists and poets that, when you're starting to write in university times, who were the ones that you...
Well, that's a hard question, because you have to say at what age. Because what you like when you're 16 is going to be quite different from what you like when you're 20, and very different from what you like when you're 40, usually.
I was thinking more about the 20s, when you were at the university studying, you had the English professors, and you did a lot of courses in English and American literature.
Yeah, I was a teenager. It's really hard to say.
Well, say books that you like to go back to. I mean, sometimes, especially with novels, it's a bit difficult sometimes.
There are some treasure troves of stories that if you absorb them quite early, you have them always as templates. And I would say a lot of folk tales. So I was an early reader of Grimm's fairy tales, Andrew Lang's collection of folk tales. The Bible, I knew it quite well from an early age. Greek mythology, again, before I was 18, I had done that quite thoroughly. And Shakespeare, we got a lot of Shakespeare in school. So as far as novels went, the rule in the 1950s high school was no sex on the page. So we were studying 19th century novels, no sex on the page. There was sex over in the shrubbery somewhere. Something was going on. You didn't know what it was, but something happened. And then Tess had a baby. I don't know quite how that came about. So we read a lot of 19th century, and a lot of Thomas Hardy we read in
George
high school.
Eliot?
We read one George Eliot. We read Mill on the Floss. Middlemarch I read later. Jane Austen, some strange person gave that to me when I was 12. So why? Because I won it as a school prize. No sex on the page or anywhere else in it. So suitable for young people. I don't know who put the collected works of Edgar Allan Poe into the school library, but that had a great effect on me. The collected works. So shall I enumerate?
No, you shouldn't.
Yeah, it's pretty terrifying. I read a lot of science fiction as a teenager, so it was the golden age of Ray Bradbury. Not only Orwell and Huxley, but a lot of other books too. Who has read Penguin Island except me?
Your father was a scientist, yeah?
Pardon? Yes, he was. Yeah, he read science fiction because he thought it was hilarious. I thought it was very funny.
Did he give it to you to read?
It was just there. He didn't need to give it. It was just there. So of course I read it, and it was the age of lurid paperback book covers. So he read those because the covers looked extremely sinful, and then you found out you were reading War and Peace. That was the 50s. You're too young to remember that. They sold these books in drugstores.
Really?
Yes, absolutely.
Well, they sell books in supermarkets now.
Yes, but different kinds of books. These were all books, all sorts of books. They were just sticking these covers on them and putting them in drugstores because it was the early age of paperbacks. So all kinds of world literature was in the drugstore with these really sleazy covers on them.
I think we're going to end with poetry, as we said, yeah?
Yes.
So what was going to happen is, I mentioned at the beginning, when we're talking about poems that derive from ancient Greek mythology, that Margaret has written quite a few of them. And so we decided that she's going to read one called Siren Brooding on Her Eggs, and from the Deree collection, and I'm going to read in Greek my translation of it.
So which should be first?
You.
Me, all right. Maybe you should be first.
Okay.
You should be first because then people will know what I'm saying.
Okay. Σιρήνα που κλωσάει τα αυγά της. Πόσο περίεργοι είναι οι άνθρωποι, αναρωτιούνται τι τραγούδι τραγουδούσαμε και παρασύραμε τόσους ναυτικούς στο θάνατό τους. Αλήθεια είναι. Αλλά τι είδους? Θάνατο εννοώ. Αιχμηρά νύχια στα χαμνά, η σάρκα να σκίζεται στα δύο, κοφτερά δόντια στο λαιμό, ή μια τελευταία ανάσα ανακούφισης όπως αυτή που βγάζουν τα αρσενικά λογάκια της Παναγίας. Κάθομαι εδώ στη βρωμερή φωλιά μου, από γραβάτες, τριμηνιαίες εκθέσεις και παντελονάκια υπαίων, ανακατεμένα με κόκαλα και μολύβια, και χτενίζω τα στήθη και τα φτερά μου. Κοιμηθείτε, μικροί μου μύθοι εσείς, πεινασμένα αυγουλάκια, που ονειρεύεστε μέσα στο αστραφτερό σας κέλυφος το εφτασφράγιστο κοριτσίστικο μυστικό μας. Η μαμά είναι εδώ, πλάι σας, και ο μπαμπάς πρέπει να σας αγαπούσε. Σας έδωσε όλες τις πρωτεΐνες του. Σας κλωσάω τώρα, να είστε δυνατά. Σύντομα θα ακούσω ένα κρακ, 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 και να, θα πεταχτείτε έξω, μωρά μου, καλυμμένα με πούπουλα, ροδαλά, υπέροχα, σαν μια πυρουέτα, χείλη επιδεκτικά προτεταμένα, μια ζαχαρωμένη βιολέτα, χτυπώντας τα λεπτεπίλεπτα φτερά σας, αδειμονώντας να πείτε το τραγούδι σας. It sounded all Greek to you.
Yes. So I've always been interested in sirens because they are half bird and half woman.
Yeah.
So then you have to ask, how do they procreate? So since the bottom half is the bird, they must lay eggs, right? It would follow biologically.
Exactly.
So how do these eggs get fertilized? You can see I had a biological background. So the only way they could get fertilized are by these sailors that the sirens are always eating.
Drowning, yeah.
Well, I think they eat them too. Yes, those are mermaids who drown them. The sirens are the ones that are, they're like the ones in the Odyssey.
Yeah.
So they're part bird. But they're very good at, come here. They're very good at that. They sing this beautiful song and it's irresistible. So I'm postulating also, in addition to sailors, they eat men who jump off cruise ships, including stockbrokers. That's why we have the neckties and the quarterly reports and the pens. Yes.
The jockey pants.
Yeah, the jockey shorts. That's their underpants.
Yeah.
So this is the siren who has laid some eggs, and she's sitting on them like a hen, waiting for them to hatch, and singing them a little song. So it's called Siren Brooding on Her Eggs. Such curious humans, wondering what song we sang to lure so many sailors to their deaths, granted, but what sort of death, I mean? Sharp bird claws in the groin, a rending pain, fanged teeth in the neck, or a last breath exhaled in bliss, like that of male praying mantises. I sit here on my frowsy nest of neckties, quarterly reports, and jockey shorts, mixed in among the bones and pens, and fluff my breasts and feathers. Lullaby my many myths, my hungry eaglets, dreaming in your glowing shells of our fail-safe girly secret. Mama's right nearby, and Daddy must have loved you. He gave you all his protein. Hatching's here. Be strong. Soon I'll hear a tap, tap, tap. Ahoy, and out you'll break, my babies, down-covered, rose-toned, lovely as a pirouette, a lipstick pout, a candied violet, flapping your dainty feathery wings and ravenous with song.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.